Ladies and gentlemen, in this RedGaming.com video, have you ever wondered how much memory is available for the Xbox Ones for running games? Have you ever wondered about the graphics core drivers? Have you ever wondered about CPU performance? Or, for example, about this mysterious 7th CPU core that's just become available? Or maybe the difference between Direct 3D on the PC and the Xbox One version? Well, in this RedGaming.com video, we're going to be covering all of that. This is going to be part 1 of a series. This is also an article. I'd highly recommend checking out. It's almost 3,000 words and contains lots of images and so on. So if you want greater detailed information as well as some graphs, you would like some tables and God knows what else, then do go ahead and check that out. It's a lot of information. So, I'm going to give you a bit of background first. Of course, this link came to us from Holt, who leaked a lot of the documentation that developers use to, well, create games on the Xbox One. But for us, the SDK isn't really the important part. As I said, it is really the documentation. I do have to give you a quick crash course on the Xbox One's hardware. If you're intimately familiar with it, you could maybe skip about 2 minutes in, but I would suggest listening anyway, simply because there are some parts that aren't so common knowledge. Anyway, let's jump in. So, the Xbox One runs 8 CPU cores, x86-64. They are based on the Jaguar architecture, and these, like many other components, are housed inside a 28nm APU. The CPU runs at 1.75 GHz, and all intents and purposes will put out 112 GFLOPS of computing power, although this is available for games developers because obviously you've got CPU core allocations. The ESRAM is included on die, and it's just available for the GPU. And despite the fact that the ESRAM is marketed to have a peak performance of over 200 GB per second, in real world, according to this documentation, it's more like 102 to 130 GB per second. Finally, you've got the DDR3 memory running at 2133 MHz, giving 68 GB per second of memory bandwidth, although not all of this bandwidth is really achievable in real life, and also not all of that memory is available to games developers. We'll get into that later because that's quite a complicated topic. And also the GPU performance has a theoretical peak of, once again, 1.31 TFLOPS, but to reiterate, not all of that is available for games in all situations, and we'll also discuss that in this very video as well. Okay, so now you're on a pretty even keel, and now we can actually discuss things in a more technical manner. So I have mentioned before, and it's not exactly uncommon knowledge, that the Xbox One runs 3 operating systems. The first operating system is the host OS. It's a hypervisor. It's relatively lightweight, and it basically will control the other 2 operating systems. This is an exclusive partition, which is running games, and obviously takes the bulk of the resources available, and a shared partition where, for example, you have the Xbox shell, the GUI, and all of that stuff will be running. Now, the ERA, which is once again the exclusive partition, has multiple states, and the full screen is the first, where all the resources available for games and allocate, and then the second is snapped or constrained. Now, the RAM allocation doesn't shrink, but CPU and GPU resources are reduced. We'll get into that further in just a second. So, if you've ever played an Xbox One, you'll notice that sometimes games do experience slowdowns when certain system stuff happens. We've noticed this particularly true on, say, Watch Dogs. One of the reasons behind this is because what is known as cross-OS calls. This is basically down to the fact that if you have a game that needs to access an OS functionality, for example, it needs to pop up a notification or what have you, it can actually take several ms per frame to do so. And so Microsoft do advise that you don't do that too many times, because it can actually have a rather negative impact on the performance, as you can imagine. One of the key factors with the development of the Xbox One has been graphics card drivers. Now, there's actually been several. When the first developmental kits came out, they were running a generic driver. For all intents and purposes, these were DirectX, Direct 3D 11 driver, which pretty much was called from manufacturer, in other words from AMD. It was very generic, Microsoft hadn't really touched it, it was basically as is. Remember that the GPU inside the Xbox One, for all intents and purposes, is just a Radeon GPU. However, this changed, and eventually Microsoft decided to make some changes, as you can imagine. So after the original one, Microsoft developed what it calls the user mode driver. This driver went under some revisions and eventually started to include features such as hardware tessellation, and started to improve over the coming months. In other words, from when it was first created, it began to evolve and additional features were added to it, which makes a great deal of sense when you consider it. However, there were some problems with it. You might recall that back when the Xbox One was, before it was even released, there was a lot of talk that it was difficult to work with, it was awkward, it was sluggish, the SDK wasn't intuitive. And so Microsoft basically put this driver together and made some changes to make it more friendly and easy and simpler to kind of bug fix, but it was not optimized for raw performance. What does that mean? In other words, you were getting less performance than what you should have been. And so, eventually, things changed in July of 2013. Microsoft added a preview version of the Direct3D monolithic runtime. This is basically a version of Direct3D that, for all intents and purposes, has had a lot of the shiny stuff that's important for PC but not important for console stripped. Think of it, it's a fixed function, right? So in other words, you don't need all of that extra stuff, and so a layer of abstraction was able to be removed, and they managed to tighten it up in a few other ways. Eventually, about a year later, and it was pretty obvious that the Direct3D monolithic driver was the way that Microsoft really wanted to go. And as you read over this API changes, you can basically see that effectively in May 2014, Microsoft cut the previous driver, the UMD, and now effectively the only driver that's available for games developers is the monolithic driver. So after that, they started to improve the asynchronous compute functionalities as well. They were no longer in preview mode, and we'll get into asynchronous compute in a later date because we've got so much more to cover still. So what about GPU reserves and allocation? Well, there's a lot to do with that as well. It's actually quite interesting because with the eventual retirement of the UMD, the changes you can see with Kinect actually kind of work. You can see that Microsoft do start to put less emphasis on Kinect technology, specifically with their improvements and optimizations. Now, as many of you know, a large chunk of memory, CPU performance, and GPU performance were originally allocated towards Kinect. In other words, they were basically not accessible for games developers. They were cordoned off whether you were going to use Kinect functionality or not. Originally, it was about 90%, however, with some tweaks, this came to about 91.5% of the Xbox One's GPU reserve is by default available for running a game's title. But developers can choose not to use certain features, and they can free up almost 100% of the GPU performance, but there are some concessions. The game OS can actually access a performance of about 1.31 teraflops of computing power, providing these conditions are met. The NUI, or NUI, or if you prefer, the Natural User Interface, which allows you to actually control apps with gestures, in other words, Kinect. Microsoft originally stated that it was actually going to be a preferred interface technology, and the Xbox One had a GPU reserve for this, in other words, to process the Kinect commands where you gesture or what have you, and this reserve was 4.5%. Now, if a game doesn't use NUI, it's actually available for the developers to actually allocate it in the game, but only during gameplay. This is very important. Microsoft specifically had prohibited this for menus and lobbies. The reason behind this is if you want to utilize biometric data, if you wanted a user to automatically be able to pick up the controller, that type of thing, and thus it must specifically request these reserves. Now, there's a remaining 4% of GPU which is allocated to extended system reserve. This is used for UI rendering and for message dialog boxes and other bits and bobs. In other words, system rendering. Now, this highly depends on the render mode, and there's some images inside the articles. You can kind of get more of an explanation on this, but Microsoft asserts that titles must be able to tolerate a variance in performance of up to 3 to 4%. In other words, it has to assume the title has to be able to withstand the fact that there could be some tolerance on rendering times. Now, in these cases, what can happen is Microsoft do say that if performance can start suffering, particularly in a snap mode situation, they actually advise you to render the game at either a lower resolution or reduced quality, which is not what you'd ideally want, but it's kind of just how it has to be, unfortunately. And anyway, now moving on to CPU and memory allocation. So CPU, if a game's running in full state, in other words, the game is active and a user is actually playing it, so, well, you know, it's not in the background, it's not snapped, you are fully, all you can see is the game. The Xbox One devotes pretty much all of the system performance that it can to run that. As I've mentioned a dozen times now, the Xbox One's CPU is in effect the AMD Jaguar, running at 1.75 GHz. 6 of these CPUs are normally available with 100% of their usage, a percent of the CPU time. In other words, all of that CPU performance is available for the game. But should the resource configuration for the game request it, 50 to 80% of the resources of the 7th CPU core can be used. In addition, 5 GB, I repeat, 5 GB of the Xbox One's 8 GB is available for games developers, meaning in effect the Xbox One has 3 GB of RAM reserved for operating system and other functionality. In other words, game developers cannot touch that memory. Further, there is no disk paging available for the RAM once it's consumed. This means developers have to be on their toes when allocating memory resources. They can't be wasteful. Now, in addition to that, you might recall that when we previously discussed the 7th CPU core, we did a massive analysis on that. So if you do need a lot more information, you could check it out. But a brief summary would be that you might recall I said it's 50 to 80% of the 7th core. It depends what's going on. Theoretically, it can be 80% all of the time, but if certain system things go on, for example, if you said Xbox go to friends, it takes 50% of the 7th CPU core to actually run that task. So if you have 100% and you take 50% away from that, what happens? Yes, it leaves you with 50%. In other words, the minimum a developer can expect is 50%, but the best they can expect for almost all of the time is 80%. The problem is, the game currently is not informed when its CPU allocation or performance on that 7th core is going to be cut down. In other words, it can't predict anything. So that's a bit of a problem. Microsoft are asserting that they will fix that in the not too distant future, but for now it's a problem and it kind of is just how it is. So as I mentioned, this also impacts the amount of memory bandwidth available for developers. As you know, the primary way that the game is rendered is actually using... Sorry, I just had a phone call, so I just got a little bit distracted, so I might repeat myself for about one sentence. Where was I? So with 68 GB per second of memory bandwidth, after these changes, assuming once again that you do decide to take advantage of them, in other words, you're not using the certain specific voice commands, once again, those voice commands are exclusive to games. So in other words, let's assume that you have Rise Son of Rome and you have those support order voice commands that you can issue. Those are the ones that basically developers have to give up. If that's the case, not only do you gain that additional 50 to 80% of CPU reserve, but you also gain 1 GB per second of memory bandwidth. So speaking of memory bandwidth, the DDR3 2133 MHz RAM inside The Xbox One can theoretically push out 68 gigabytes per second of memory bandwidth, which isn't too bad. This number, by the way, is a combined total of both read and write. So obviously this is not a realistic situation, even slightly, but it could be that you get a read of 60 gigabytes per second and write of 8, and that would be still taking up the entire total. In reality, however, Microsoft concedes that this number is, and I quote, not achievable, and developers will actually hit between 80 to 85% of memory bandwidth, or, to put it another way, 55 gigabytes per second down to about 57.8 gigabytes per second, depending, once again, on what's going on. Regarding the processor core allocation and cache information, as we've stated billions of times now, there are 8 AMD Jaguar cores inside the system, but they are created on 2 processor modules. Now, each of these modules houses 4 processor cores, and each of those modules house its own level 2 cache memory, which the 4 processors must share, and they also share the bandwidth to the main memory too. So, for example, Core 0 and Core 2 are sharing the same cache because they're on the same module, and must use the same bus to access the DDR3 memory. But CPU Core 5 and CPU Core 2 do not share the same level 2 cache because they are not physically on the same module. Thus, if a CPU core wishes to access the other module's level 2 cache, it has to basically go around the block. It has to actually go through the North Bridge, which is quite costly in terms of performance. In fact, a local level 2 cache hit takes about 30 cycles. A remote level 2 cache hit can take 100 cycles, so it's quite profound, over 3 times slower. Thus, developers need to actually plan this quite well, and this, by the way, also goes with the assumption of level 1 cache as well. Once again, level 1 cache remote is quite slow, 120 cycles, compared to a local level 1, which can be 3 to 5 cycles depending on the bit value. Now, because of this, developers have to actually plan their CPU threads correctly. So let's assume that a certain thread is going to be interacting with an OS shared apps. It's actually better to have that on the module, so that's basically running the OS stuff. So in this case, it would be CPU, it would be module 2. So for example, it could be running on Core 4 or 5 for that very reason. Microsoft also asserts that despite the fact that the level 2 cache is doubled in comparison to the Xbox 360, because the number of cores has actually increased by a factor of 2.6, it is worth noting, however, as a slight caveat, that the Xbox 360 CPU is a lot different in how it works, and actually was a tri-core processor but handled 2 threads per core. But when you can couple this with the fact that the Microsoft's Xbox One pointers consume twice the amount of memory on a cache per core basis, the Xbox One actually has less level 2 cache available than the Xbox 360, and furthermore, DRAM, in other words the DDR3 memory, the 8 gigabytes, contention is actually a bigger issue than what it was on Xbox 360. So in other words, it's actually easier for the GPU or the CPU to adversely impact the other one. So for example, you can have a situation where the CPU takes a lot of memory bandwidth and thus it starts eating into GPU performance, or as I said, the reverse. Thus, Microsoft say that it's critical that you optimize to reduce memory bandwidth for a key strategy for the Xbox One, which kind of tells you it all, really. Onion and garlic might sound familiar to you, and no, it's not because they're most likely in your kitchen. There are actually 2 buses which are also on the PlayStation 4. Now we're going to be doing a further analysis on this in the next part of the video, because this is getting into the realms of cache coherency and compute and some other factors as well, and thus I don't want to start muddying the waters too much, but I do want to get this out of the way. The Xbox One has 2 buses available for the GPU to access main system RAM. The first of these is Garlic. Now it's designed to reduce latency. It has 4 channel bus and it runs at a peak memory bandwidth of 68 gigabytes per second. You might notice that ties in really well with the DDR3. That's not a coinkydink. In fact, it's actually directly proportional to the main memory bandwidth, and it's worth noting that the PlayStation 4, because it's using that GDDR5 RAM, actually has the Onion bus running at 176 gigabytes per second. These 4 Garlic channels connect directly to each other, or each of the 4 DRAM controllers which comprise the Xbox One, or Xbox One's memory. And the second is Onion. Now it's non-coherent, and it has 2 channel bus. Now this is quite important because there's a difference in read and write. It can read at 24 gigabytes per second, but it can only write at 16 gigabytes per second. This limitation is due to the North Bridge, and the 2 Onion controllers connect directly to the memory controller, so there are some operations that you simply cannot do via the Garlic, and you must do them only via the Onion. And I think that's a good place to call this particular video an article, because it's already pretty lengthy. There's a hell of a lot more information for me to go through, but I've spent a lot of time today and the last couple of days actually going through this stuff. The next article is going to be going through the GPU specific stuff that's part of the Xbox One, possibly the audio components as well, and we might start hitting the compute as well as some cachey stuff. Maybe go further into the bus as well. But I think that gives you a good basic overview of the Xbox One's internal components. So what I'd really love for you guys to do, and show me a lot of love and a lot of appreciation, is if you would like the post or check the article and kind of share that as well. And all of the normal stuff, it would be greatly appreciated. But with all of that said, I'm going to leave you to it. So do check out the article, as I said, if you need more information. On the meanwhile, if you have a specific question or want more information on a specific area, the next part of this article will be up most likely either Tuesday or Wednesday. I'm going to try and do the majority of the work tomorrow. Just to give you the date, in case you're watching this in the future, we are going by the 11th of January of 2015. So if you're watching this in, like, 4 months' time, it's probably up by then. But as I said, if you have specific questions in the meanwhile, you can get hold of me either via Twitter or you can get hold of me via Facebook. So go to facebook.com/RedGamingTech, or if you want my Twitter, you can tweet me directly at RGTCrimsonRain. I repeat one more time, RGTCrimsonRain. Anyway, with all of that said, really hope you liked the video. I'll see you soon. Take care. Bye for now.